Hey everybody, this is going to be a fun one. Our master class today is going to be fun. First thing, we got to remember two things primarily about today's master class. The first thing is the very first thing that we spoke about, which is what is Mass? What is the purpose of it? So Mass is an act of worship. We are worshiping. What does worship mean? It means maybe a few things, but primarily, foundationally, it means that our focus is on God. That's so incredibly important, and we probably need to remember that, remind ourselves of that as often as we possibly can. The purpose of Mass is meant to be focused on God, worshiping Him. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, what is the role of the priest? When we get to Mass, I guess we haven't necessarily spoken about this, although we've certainly made reference to it when we talk about Jewish worship in the temple. Because the role of the priest in Jewish worship is basically the same. It's maybe not exactly the same, but I think it is basically the same as the role of the priest in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, which is what? That the priest is a mediator between God and the people. He's a mediator. In other words, he stands between the people to offer sacrifice, to offer worship to God on the people's behalf. Now, again, it's not exactly the same between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because something happens in the New Testament with baptism that actually makes all the people priests in a way. And so now there's a difference between a ministerial priest and a baptized priest, and we're all priests, and we're all there to offer the worship. And so maybe in the Old Testament, there was this sense of less activity among the unordained people, among the non-priests. They would bring their sacrifices, but that was maybe the end of it or something like that. Whereas now we have everyone is a priest, and so we're all bringing our sacrifices, but we're all to participate actively in the offering. But nonetheless, the role is basically the same, that the priest acts as a mediator between God and man, God and the people. Okay, those two things are incredibly important. Because it's going to provide for us an image or a foundation for the image that we're going to talk about when we talk about what we're doing at Mass, or the posture of the priest at Mass. So again, going back to the Jerusalem temple, what would happen? The people would come to their respective area in the temple, whether it was the court of the Gentiles or the court of the women or the court of the men, and they would bring their offering to the priest, who would then turn and offer that offering as a sacrifice to God. So he would turn, and his posture would reflect that reality, that he was offering it on their behalf. So in other words, what would happen is the priest would come, of course, facing the people to receive the offering, but then when it came time to offer, to sacrifice the offering, who would he face? Well, he would face God, because he's acting as a mediator between God and the people. And he's offering his worship not to the people, but to God. So that's an important reality to happen, so that he would face the same direction as the people. And it's not a matter of direction, it's that he would face the same person as the people, which is God the Father. And this is ultimately what we want to talk about with Mass, the priest facing the same direction as the people, because he's there to offer the sacrifice of the Eucharist to God on behalf of the people. And I know that this is a little bit tricky because some of us grew up in a time when we didn't really understand what the Mass was. And so our understanding is like, well, the priest had his back to us and he did his own thing, and that's just how it was. And we had no idea what was going on. So some people would go to Mass and they would pray and whatever, but Father had his back to us. That's not the right way to phrase that. And I understand that it's very common to phrase that, and so we might not fully be aware of what's going on. And that's the purpose of this master class, actually, is to help us understand what's going on. The priest would not have his back to us, but the priest would be facing the same direction as us, because he was offering the sacrifice for us on our behalf, even while we maybe hopefully participated in the offering. But even if we didn't fully know what was going on, that's what was going on. The priest was facing the same direction. That's how some people grew up, actually. So the Mass, there was a big change that took place in like the 1960s, the end of the 1960s, after the Second Vatican Council, where what happened? The Mass was allowed now to be offered in the vernacular. Before it was offered just in Latin, this holy and sacred language, the language of the church, ultimately our mother tongue. But now the Mass is able to be offered in the vernacular. That is to say, it could be offered in English, it could be offered in German, in Spanish, in French, in Portuguese, in Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. Like it could be offered in all kinds of different languages, and still actually it could be offered in Latin. But the whole point of that, of allowing the Mass to be offered in the language that we understand, is so that we can understand what's being said, what's being prayed, the way that the sacrifice is being offered. And then a strange thing happened, actually. So the church officially declared that the Mass could be offered with this particular language. The church did not officially mandate that the priest would come around to the other side of the altar and face the people. It didn't mandate that, and yet that's something that happened pretty much universally. Most priests, almost all priests and bishops, decided that in offering the Mass from this vernacular perspective, from speaking the same language as the people, they would also offer the Mass versus populum. So the prior posture was ad orientem, toward the east, which for the early Christians, they literally would face the eastern direction. They would face east. They would face Jerusalem, which was in the Western world east. Now it's like a liturgical east, facing the Lord with the people, leading the people in the sacrifice. But then the priest started offering the Mass from the other side of the altar, versus populum, against the people, and not against them, but facing them rather than facing God. And this happened all over the place. So what happened for a lot of people, they grew up in a time where they didn't understand anything that was going on. So Mass was never really explained to them, and so maybe didn't understand anything, but mostly speaking, people didn't understand what was going on. So then when the priest started speaking their language and then started looking at them from their perspective, then it was like, oh, this feels better. It feels more like a communal gathering rather than not knowing what I'm doing, and that's really nice. And I don't want to critique that in any way, except it's not the purpose of the Mass. Remember, the purpose of the Mass is to offer worship to God, and that was still not really explained very well. So then people still had an understanding of Mass that was lacking according to the true purpose of it. And so what happened was we end up kind of basically in the same situation, except not only in the same situation, but now our understanding of the Mass is skewed a bit. And it's not quite what the church and God wants it to be, which is to understand that it is not primarily a communal gathering, but it is primarily an act of divine worship. And so something that's actually happening among priests, especially younger priests, is we see this imagery of the priest standing between God and the people and facing the same direction as the people, offering the sacrifice, leading the people in the sacrifice of the Mass. And so a lot of priests are actually enjoying that image and engaging it, embracing it, by coming around to the other side of the altar, which some people would say would be like the front of the altar, and offering the Mass ad orientem. Again, this isn't like a majority thing, although I think someday it will actually get back to being a majority that most priests will do this. But it's just some priests. But the primary point here is not to say that well, I do think one is better than the other. I was going to say the primary point is not to say that one is better than the other. I do actually think one is better than the other. I really like that image. I didn't actually like it at first. When I heard about this, I thought this doesn't make sense to me. But as I've come to understand the Mass more and more, the image that offering the Mass ad orientem, facing the same direction as the people, it provides a better image of what's going on. And hopefully it helps us all put our focus on God rather than looking at the priest and the priest looking at the people. Hopefully together we can all look at God and offer our worship to Him according to what the church desires and commands, actually. That's the thing. And I'm not saying the church commands us to offer worship ad orientem, but I think it's just easier for us to focus on God when everyone is facing the same direction as opposed to facing opposite directions. So anyway, I hope that's helpful for you, and feel free to leave comments and share this with other people. I think this is a really great thing for us to engage in, this masterclass, so that we can understand Mass in a better way. I will see you next week. Peace.